Well, let me welcome you to episode 18 of our reflections on the Psalms, as once again we return to this beautiful little canopy on another gorgeous morning. And if you are watching this living within the British Isles, well, I hope you're enjoying this fabulous weather we've been having. So I'm going to do something slightly different on this particular episode, because up to now we've dealt with the whole of a psalm in one episode. Whereas I can't do this with Psalm 18. I'm only going to talk about the first 6 verses, and I'm going to read them as we look at them, and then perhaps the next episode I'll finish Psalm 18 off. Why do I do that? Because when I started to read this psalm, some of the words David uses straight away made me think about all sorts of things, which would have meant this episode would have been far too long if I did all that and then carried on and did the rest of the psalm as well. And so to make it easier on you, we're looking at just a few thoughts from this psalm. So let's open it up. David starts the psalm, Psalm 18, and again I'm just reading from the English Standard Version. This is what he says: I love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge. My shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies. This is David's great confidence coming through this, but the reason why it kind of really speaks to me and challenges me is just the opening line. Now, reading it as a Western Christian, we would probably think, well, what's so big about that? I love you, O Lord, my strength. But to the Hebrew understanding, particularly the ancient world, the term God and love were not two terms that went together. The ancient world did not perceive that God was someone to be loved, if you like. You go right back to the historical kind of understandings of the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, those very first cultures, and you fast forward that right through to perhaps more familiar cultures of the Greeks, who at one time under Alexander conquered most of the known world, and the Romans, who probably did just about the same after them. Neither of these cultures perceived that God was someone to be loved. He was to be feared, he was to be respected, he was to be honoured and appeased perhaps, and worshipped, and largely that worship would have been expressed through sacrifices being made. All these things were far more the way they related to God than using terms like love. And so when David begins by saying, I love you, Lord, he's expressing that something that you could almost say was uniquely Hebrew for his time. Not only was monotheism a particularly Hebrew thing, and monotheism being the belief in one God only, which was very unique in that time, because classically most of the known world were polytheistic. They believed in many gods. But not only was the Hebrews uniquely monotheistic, but they were uniquely people who loved and expressed love to their God, and a God who required love from them, which was again a very unique thing. In the world around them, the ancient world, they were polytheistic. They believed that there was many gods. They had the idea that in life you needed lots of people to do things that you needed doing. You didn't rely on one person only. That was bizarre. You understood that life was about community, and lots of people provided you for lots of different needs. In the same way, they could not get their head around the fact that one God could be expected to meet all their needs, and so therefore there was gods at different levels for different things, providing you for different means. And that's why their idea was very much that of polytheism, that God was in many different places. But there were some then who had developed a kind of what you could call henotheism, which was slightly different. That was the worship of one supreme God above them all, but in many forms. And so the Egyptians had the god Isis, which was a reflection of that henotheistic way of thinking. The interesting thing is, when you look back to the Hebrews, you could say that the Hebrews were a mixture between monotheism, one God and one God only, and henotheism, the belief that there was a supreme God, but in many forms. Let me explain. Jody Magnus is a keen and distinguished professor for teaching excellence in early Judaism, based at the University of North Carolina. She uses a term to define the ancient Hebrews' thinking, and the term is monolatry. Monolatry, which is the worship of one God without denying the existence of other gods. Her belief was that the Hebrews didn't go around saying, no, I don't believe there is other gods, I don't believe any of these gods exist, I just think you made them all up. There's only one God, and that's Jehovah. Their belief wasn't that there was no other deity, but their belief was that God was the most supreme deity above all others, that only God could deliver them, that only God could be their rock and their foundation, that any other God, although they were real, they were in comparison just a kind of frauds, if you like. And that comes through in this Hebrew word. Now, the Hebrew word for God that kind of defined him as the God above anybody else is the Hebrew word El Elyon, E-L-E-L-Y-O-N, El Elyon. It means God Most High. And it's an interesting term because it's a term that says God is most higher than any other God. And so it's reflected again in the Psalms. Look at David in Psalm 46 and verse 4. He says, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. Again in Psalm 50 and verse 14, offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving, he says, and perform your vows to the Most High. And again in Psalm 57 verse 2, I cry out to God Most High. It's an appreciation that yes, there is a plurality of gods, but that Jehovah, Yahweh, is supremely authoritative, is supremely reigning over all of them, that there is one God who is the Most High God above any other. The Jews could have perceived as, well, as possessing also a blend of henotheism. Why do I say that? Because although they did believe in one supreme God, they believed that there was multiple ways that God expressed himself. For example, the Hebrews had at least 20 different names they assigned to God, and each of those names defined and reflected some part of God's sovereignty, of God's character. It's an intriguing insight that the character and the intent of God towards his creation, that he would ask us not simply to honor and respect him, but actually to love him, which is a phenomenal thing. I think if a God had no ambition for relationship, they would not ask for love. Do you think so? To ask for someone's love implies some form of intimate friendship. None of us would go up to a person in the street, a random stranger, and say, I want you to love me. In honesty, we probably really couldn't care less if they did or they didn't. But if our wives or our husbands didn't express that love, if our children didn't express that love, if our brothers or sisters or our parents didn't express that love, we would be incredibly worried, because we want a relationship with them. We want that intimacy with them. We want that connection with them. A connection that we don't particularly want from people who are just randomly office acquaintances or people we don't really know that much. And so when God calls upon his people to love him, he is wanting that connection. He's wanting that relationship. When a God is asking only that we respect and only that we honor him and only that we fear him and revere him, it's kind of implying a one-way relationship. You give to me fear, you give to me respect, you give to me honor. In return, I may do something for you, or to be honest, I'll just avoid obliterating you when I get ticked off. That is a one-way relationship, which many of the ancients had a perception that God was a bit like that. Keep him happy and things will go well, but don't upset him. And it was that fear and revere and honoring relationship that was kind of to-ing and fro-ing. The Hebrews, well, they demonstrated something quite unique. That sense of loving, that sense of Well, once you begin to talk about man and God loving each other, you open up a whole new arena of thought. It elevates us to a very different level than simply offering sacrifices and being obedient. When David could from his heart say, I love you, O Lord, he is reflecting a radically different understanding of God than anybody else. He introduces us into a human-divine interaction and takes it to a very different dialogue. When we talk about love, God requesting our love is not just an added afterthought. It's not God saying, the more significant thing is that you fear and respect, but, as an add-on, it'd be nice if you also love me. No, God's saying this is the primary thing. What I want more than anything else is not just your fear and what I really want is your love, and I want to love you. And this is the incredibly unique interaction that Jesus cemented in many ways when he began to talk and teach about the kingdom of God. And in doing that, God is reflecting mutual interaction. He's reflecting this heartfelt connection between us, which is a powerful thing. David's connection with God is such that his life journey echoes many of the attributes of God. Look at verse 2. There are several words that David uses to define God: rock, fortress, deliverer, God, refuge, shield, horn, stronghold. It's remarkable. But these are not just David saying, I fear this God and I recognize these are true of you. David's saying, I have walked these things. I have experienced God in these ways. He's not making a theological statement. He's making a kind of a soulful diary, an expression of his own heart. This isn't David giving textbook assent to God and saying this is the way God is. These words are representative of David's journey. They embrace his story. They embrace his life walk, if you like. They speak of, it's almost like an experiential creed that David utters as he talks about himself, this diary of the soul, if you like. And it's interesting because, of course, that raises another issue. So on one side we have the issue of love, and why was that important? Because it was incredibly unique, because it reflects something of the heart of God and the intent of God through the ages, because it connects us to God in ways that are far more deeper and profounder than simply offering a sacrifice or doing what we're told. But the other thing it raises is this: as David is expressing all this great love for God, the idea would be, well, why would David express such love and gratitude? Was it because ultimately he wanted something from God? Which raises the question about the motives that drive all of us in our expressions of love and goodness. Martin Luther, the reformer, had a real issue with this, about what he could term as selfless love towards God, because he felt that most of the time when he loved God, or trying to love God, it was either to avoid punishment or to gain some kind of reward. He felt that most of the time we love God because it's good for us to love God, and he struggled with that and wanted to desperately love God for simply who God was and not for any other reason, but found that every time he did, he uncovered within himself those subtle secondary reasons which used to rack him a bit and strain him with a bit of guilt on that. But of course it does raise a question for all of us about how selflessly we love God, or whether our love for God is purely based on a love of reward, or perhaps a fear of retribution, a fear of punishment. And sometimes that can be tested, that as soon as things go bad in our lives, it's absolutely staggering how fast our love dissolves, or certainly becomes less vehement and less strong as it was. And it makes us ponder the question of why do we love God in the first place? One side can seek to avoid God's displeasure, so we don't want that, so we're going to love God. The other side is, well, I want to draw God's goodness towards him, so I'm going to love him so that he'll do things for me. It's kind of a weird relationship, don't you think? If you approached your marriage that way and thought, well, I'm going to love my wife, my husband more, because that way when I need them to do something for me, they're probably going to be more inclined to do it. Or, sadly, you could be married to someone who could be very difficult and perhaps even a bit aggressive, and it's like, well, I better love them and show sweetness because they might react negatively toward me, which is a terrible place to be. But some people are in that place with God and they believe that's what it is. And so the genuineness of their love always has to be questioned. And I think Luther struggled with all this. And it could be that some would level this argument against David. They might be saying, well, you know, David opens this psalm declaring his love for God, only to then proceed to list all the ways that God had protected him, upheld him, sustained him, and blessed him. And, well, a cynical heart could suggest that David's love for God, if you like, though it might not be completely motivated by these things, must certainly have been heavily influenced by them. David is loving God powerfully, passionately, because, let's face it, God has done so much stuff for him. There's a little echo here in the devil's accusation against Job, don't you think? The devil said to Job, no wonder he worships you, because look at the hedge you have put around him. You remember that story? And God gives the devil permission to brutally remove, completely remove the hedge around Job. And it got to a stage where even his own health was in danger. Such was God's commitment to appreciating that love can exist even without the accoutrements. Love can exist even without the fringe benefits. Love can exist even when it's not popular or not even healthy to love. That's genuine love. That's what Luther was driving at. That's what turned him over and over in guilt, that he couldn't get to that place. And I think when we look at David, it is probably more likely that what we're seeing in this psalm is David's gratitude and expression of devotion as a way of recounting his story. He's not trying to win God's favor. He's not trying to impress God. He's not trying to whip up enthusiasm or deflect guilt or some kind of potential punishment. On the contrary, David is expressing his gratitude and love by understanding God in these ways and what that has come to mean to him, because he has lived these moments where God was his rock, his fortress, his deliverer, his refuge, like a family who express deep appreciation for one another, having passed through a mutual, intense ordeal together, grateful of one another's support and love. This is David looking back, grateful on God, that God has been there for him, that God has walked with him, hand in glove, if you like, and upheld him in the worst and most perilous of times that he's been through. And the thought is reflected in the third verse. David says, I shall call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies. See that? I call upon the Lord, I am saved. What is David saying? I shout, I get an answer. I appeal, I'm not ignored. I groan, and I am heard. Here is the bedrock of David's affection. I am seen, I am known, I am heard. Seen, known, and heard. They have got to be the three greatest longings of a troubled heart. When we are seen, when we are known, when we are heard in our worst times, it is a phenomenal comfort, but not just a comfort, it's a strengthener of our lives. It gives us backbone when we need it. And the critical aspects following that, of course, are reflected in the verses David says. In verses 4, 5, and 6, this is what we read. The cords of death encompassed me. The torrents of destruction assailed me. The cords of Sheol entangled me. The snares of death confronted me. In my distress I called upon the Lord. To my God I cried for help. From his temple he heard my voice, and my cry to him reached his ears. David is able to acknowledge that in his deepest, darkest, most fearful, most hopeless moments, he was aware of God, sharing that space with him. David's not trying to gain some kind of reward by reeling through the names of God and celebrating all those aspects of God. He's not trying to deflect from some kind of guilt that he's carrying, or perhaps sweeten God up so he doesn't get punished. David's simply saying, this is my story. This is my story. You wouldn't believe, he said, the depth of places I've been in. You wouldn't believe the closeness I've been to death and the destruction of stuff I've seen and the destructive elements I felt within myself. But God has been there. He's been my rock. He's been my refuge. He's been my sustainer. He's been my helper. He has blessed me. This is David saying, this is my story. This is the reality. And this is why I love God, because I have journeyed with him. He's become integral to all that I understand of life and do in life. And here is the gut of it, that when we talk about loving God, we do so because he is in our story. He is part of what we do and what we value, and God is shaping and turning us. And so even in these opening lines of this psalm, you see how much is reflective of what he's saying. God is sovereign, God is grace, God is love. These are powerful thoughts and credible truths about the nature and the intent of God. So I want you to just perhaps take these words again, maybe reread them, appreciate that the fact that God wants a relationship with you and I says a massive amount about the character of God. He isn't a God who's simply up there to be appeased and to be satisfied. He's a God who wants to connect to us in a very loving and a very soulful way. It's a powerful concept and of great value to the human life. So let me just encourage you to reread those words, and as you do, God will bless you. I am certain of it. God bless you.